One day, a wooden man, Pinocchio, disappeared from my closet. His father brought it from a business trip to give it to the daughter of some boss, but for some unknown reason, the donation did not take place. The little awkward man remained standing in the closet, behind the glass, and I got so used to it that I no longer allowed it to be given to anyone. The loss was discovered on the third day. Someone stuck a stick right at my entrance and put Pinocchio's head on it. There were no eyes. Instead of them, there were holes. I found the torso, without arms and without legs, that same day near the trash heap. It was all burned and melted. I couldn't just throw away the head and body and bury them in a vacant lot. I figured out the author without difficulty. It was GSH. Let's call him Gosha, classmate. I won't dwell on the reasons, it's not interesting. People are envious and cruel. Children especially. Gosha, apparently, wanted to enjoy the spectacle of the suffering Dima running around the school in search of his adversary. But I didn't give him such pleasure. Look, I said sadly to Gosha in the morning at school, some freaks broke my Pinocchio. Now, I added after a pause, I don't know what will happen to them. Oh yes, Gosha answered me significantly. Now you'll catch them one by one, and... No, I said. I even feel sorry for them fools. They themselves don't know what they're dealing with. Gosha became wary. This is a very bad omen, I continued. This is simply a lethal omen. Worse than any black cat. Pinocchio is actually Pinocchio, and you can't touch him. Don't you know history? Not this story about the golden key, but the real story. Well, answered Gosha, I heard something like that, and I told the real story about Pinocchio. A long time ago, back in the Middle Ages, a shoemaker, Carlo Pinocchio, lived in one city. He had an only son. Carlo loved his son very much because he was already old and his wife left him. But then people in the city began to die from a strange disease. First they went blind, then they became covered with ulcers, then their legs were lost and they could only crawl. No one lived longer than 3 days. More and more people were getting sick. They died so often that they did not have time to perform funeral services and make coffins for them. And the dead began to be buried in huge common graves. But when there was no one to dig the common graves, they began to burn them. The bodies were placed in piles, interspersed with firewood and boards to help them burn better. But the flames did not burn. The suffocating fumes filled everything around. The smoke obscured the sun, and the day turned into night. Day and night gray smoke spread over the city, and the ringing of bells floated. In the smoky darkness, carts loaded with the dead moved slowly along the narrow streets, and soldiers in canvas caps with holes for eyes sat on goats with torches. Several times Carlo saw strange people who looked like birds through the smoke. These were doctors. They were wrapped in long black cloaks and all wore masks with long wooden noses. The noses were hollow. They were stuffed with incense and herbs, which were then believed to protect against harmful air. The doctors did not touch the infected, but held long thin sticks in their hands, which they used to indicate the ulcers of the patients. That year, everyone who lived on Carlo Street died. His son also died, but Carlo himself did not die. He had, as they would say now, immunity to the disease. He left the city and settled in a small village on the outskirts in a small hut. But everyone avoided Carlo's hut, because Carlo has lost his mind. Instead of his son, he made himself a large, human-sized wooden doll. The doll was made roughly and ineptly. After all, Carlo was a shoemaker, not a carpenter. It was angular, awkward, with a long nose, like a bird's, and holes instead of eyes. But old Carlo wrapped her in his old cloak, put her to bed and sat her down at the table and talked to her like a person. The local priest called Carlo an idolater, and he was no longer allowed into the church. People did not speak to him, and the boys, seeing Carlo, whistled and threw stones at him. When old Carlo was paralyzed, no one dared to enter the half-collapsed hut. The children set fire to the hut, and he burned there along with his doll. And then all these children disappeared, one by one. They said that a wooden man came for them at night. And since then, I made it up as I went, surprising myself. The Italians have an old proverb, don't offend Pinocchio. This is like our, don't dig a hole for someone else, because there is a belief that Pinocchio, the wooden man, will come for anyone who offends his image and likeness, his doll. On the first night, when Pinocchio arrives, the offender wakes up because he hears his steps at the door. Just dead wooden steps. And then Pinocchio hits the door 3 times with his wooden hand. And on the third knock, the offender's legs are taken away. He is paralyzed from the waist down. On the second night, Pinocchio enters the house. He is not afraid of any locks. All latches and bolts open in front of him. He just opens the door and walks in. He is tall and angular and is all wrapped in dark clothes. His head is hidden by a hood. His face is not visible in the shadows. And when the offender sees Pinocchio, he is completely paralyzed. And then Pinocchio comes for the third time. He enters the room of the offender, who is chained to the bed and bends down. With a wooden hand, he throws back the hood, and then the offender sees his head a round, rough block and his wooden nose, long like a bird's, and eyes. Pinocchio, strictly speaking, has no eyes at all. There are two holes with rough edges drilled all the way through the head. And when the offender looks into these holes, he sees nothing behind them. No wallpaper pattern on the opposite wall, no pupil, no light, only endless, bottomless blackness. A paralyzed abuser cannot escape. He cannot scream. He only wheezes and moves a foreign swollen tongue in his mouth. And then Pinocchio gouges out the eyes of the offender with a long, rusty stick. That evening, I went to Gosha's to pick up the markers I had given him so he could color the outline maps. It was already late. Gosha's parents still didn't come. Gosha clearly didn't want to be left alone, but he showed off and didn't show it. I tried to leave several times, but he either showed me a new slingshot, or the book Tanks of the Second World War, or for some reason asked me about my father. Then we heard the entrance door slam below. It was perfectly audible on the third floor. Gosha fell silent. Someone began to climb the stairs. Finally, I thought, his parents have arrived. But the steps were somehow strange. He was probably drunk or disabled, because he rose very slowly, with some kind of creaking and shuffling, as if on crutches. Who is that there? Gosha suddenly asked. I looked at him. Gosha was all gray. Then it dawned on me. It's his dead feet knocking, I said quietly. We both fell silent. But then the steps stopped. All that could be heard was the ticking of the clock. Half a minute passed. There was nothing. Damn, you're already annoying, said Gosha. Dima, you're already fucking tired with your jokes. I had been laughing for a long time, but then I started laughing openly. We laughed, in general. And then I said, that's it, it's time to go home. Mother said to be home at 10. Gosha came out to take me to the vestibule. By the way, I turned around at the door. We didn't hear him enter the apartment. Did you want to go? So go, said Gosha. He slammed the door behind me, and I headed towards the exit. My eyes did not immediately get used to the darkness. There was no light on the stairs, the light bulb was broken, and only weak light from the street came through the windows. I went down 2 flights of stairs, and he stopped. Below, in the window niche, someone was sitting slouched. It was dark, and I could vaguely discern that this someone was long, awkward, and he was sitting with his face turned to the corner, not moving. He was probably drunk, I thought. There were no homeless people then. Yes, he's drunk. They won't let him home. Or he was wrong. Sometimes when you're drunk, you walk into the entrance and make a mistake and fell asleep. Or it's an old man and he was going up the stairs. Well, yes, he was going up the stairs and he was tired and he sat down to rest, and I'd rather take the elevator. Now I'll go up and take the elevator. I went back up 2 flights and called the elevator. A couple of years have passed since that incident. The other day I met a former classmate on the street. We hadn't seen each other for 100 years and spent the whole evening in a cafe. He said that Gosha died a year ago. Gosha smoked in bed, fell asleep, and suffocated in the smoke.